Hello Internet. Today we're going to go over the disassembly of the dial set Compur shutter. I do show an image of that on the screen now. This is the second video in this series. This is the first that I'm sure most will find interesting. We're going to go ahead and get that started now. Okay, so first we take the shutter itself, and you can see here me first removing the element capsules, the front lens and back lens off the shutter. Now with these, I have already loosened the capsules themselves using a friction tool. The shutter itself, as you can see, has also been already removed from the camera using the spanner tool you can see on the right. Now you can see me clumsily removing the retaining screw for the speed set dial, turning out the wavy washer there. Now with these plates, these set the actual timing with the levers you can see through the holes. I am using the tweezers because they do not like coming off easily, because they have to come out straight because of how tightly they fit on that post. And here I'm removing the 3 screws from the caulking lever. Now with this, you only need to remove the outside screws. That center screw actually holds the main drive spring assembly together, and that is not one you would need to take apart at this point. And these 2 lowercase screws, one goes through the shutter release lever, that is the shorter of the 2 screws, and the longer screw is the one that goes underneath the caulking lever. And then here, the setting dial, I'm removing that. It is not necessary, but I do remove it just to make sure that when I put it all back together, I can make sure it's properly located within the mechanism. And here I'm just putting the screws with that cover plate. And I remove the shutter release lever. It should just slide right off. And here I'm looking over it, getting a good idea of where the various levers are. You will see me throughout this video prod at some of the levers with the tweezers and various tools, just so I can have a good idea of how it's working. Here I'm just checking the motion on the diaphragm or aperture setting lever. Now the shutter itself was set in time, and I had inadvertently left it open. When I brushed the lever there, it did go ahead and release it as it brought the mechanism out of that timed shutter position. The other thing that prodding at the mechanism does is also allows for verifying the functionality. Now here I am removing the spring tension off of that lever and removing the screws that hold that lever, the tension lever, which moves the main drive spring tension to that timing lever, and then the function select lever. Now these are spanner screws. Unfortunately, the spanner driver set I got was not fine enough tipped, and not of a high enough quality I could actually modify them myself, and they still work. Uh, the openings on these screws are extremely fine, as you can see in that one I just set on the table. Uh, Unfortunately, the tool for those is not something that is widely available, because these types of mechanical shutters, unfortunately, are becoming fewer and fewer, and most of them still out there primarily use flathead screws and not necessarily the spanner head screws that are found in this shutter at select locations. Now, here I've fully removed the function select lever. That's what moves between the timed, bulb, and interval, uh, the TBI on the shutter. Now here I'm releasing a spring for the uh, interval lever. It is a fairly stiff spring, so it does take a bit of effort to get out. And here I'm just removing that screw and the interval lever. Now in newer Compur shutters, that interval lever with the gear train often comes in a single mechanism, often referred to as the self-delay timer or the retard gear train. And with this lever here, there is actually a cutout in the lens tube that the end of that goes into. And you can see here, what I'm trying to do is actually move it through the gear train so as to be able to clear that notch and pull that lever out. And here I'm just looking over to see, again, making sure where all the different parts go. Um, I just pulled the wavy washer for that mode select arm. And there again, I'm just releasing various springs that are located within the shutter, some of which are very tight, as you can tell from the video. And here I'm removing the actual actuator arm. This is the arm itself that does move the shutter control ring. There's the spring for it and the lever itself. And here I'm unhooking the springs and again checking at functionality and action of the various levers. And this lever is part of the ratchet system used in the timed shutter function. And removing the upper screw from this particular lever, which acts to maintain a minimum tension on the main drive spring. And then here I try to pull that out. In the other shutter I have, same style, there was only that one screw holding it in. Now here I'm removing the anchor pawl from the delay gear drive. And I'm going to go ahead and do a visual inspection, see if there's any sort of teeth missing, any damage to those teeth. And to help, I go ahead and drive and back drive those gears. As you saw, my tweezers did slip off the gears. You do need to be careful. I was very lucky in that none of them were stripped. And here I'm removing the intermediary cover for that gear train. And just make sure that the levers aren't rubbing against the top of those gears. And again, with these gears, just like with the timer select or the interval select, they do need to be pulled out straight because they are a very tight fit. And here I'm just finding the right screwdriver for the ratchet gear. And again, giving another inspection because that lower gear on that one is not visible. Just looking for any sort of damaged or broken teeth. And then here I'm removing the uh, cable release lever. You'll see that nipple just to the left of that screw there. Uh, that's where the shutter release cable would screw in, and then it would push on that lever to actuate the shutter itself. And here again, I'm just checking levers in that area, making sure that they are working like they should and seeing how the spring on there is connected to make sure that it is put back properly during reassembly. And this is the other portion of the anchor lever, because that works with a compound pivot. The lever itself is on a pivot, and then the pivot which it is on also pivots. And you'll notice I do check the screws. One is to check the condition, but also to help me identify which screws are going with which should they get mixed up. As you can see, as I lay the parts on the table, the fasteners are going with the individual levers. And then here, I'm just removing the screw from that main lever there. That lever is on a pivot which is screwed into the plate. I do not have a tool to remove that, so that piece does stay with the plate and gets cleaned in place. There you see I removed the last screw, and I'm just looking for any sort of shim washers, which I do find one here. Now, between some dried grease and a tight fit, shim washer, as you can see, is a little bit difficult to remove, but I do get that off. Being I couldn't pick it up with the tweezers, I did attempt to pick it up with my fingertip, and it ran away. I do find it by the end of the video. I do make a quick check to see if it might have just disappeared under the toothpick. So here I'm still trying to see if I can find it. And I'm turning the shutter over so I can separate the mechanism plate from the case. By removing the 4 screws here. Now you do have to make sure that the aperture setting ring is set away from the 4, because it will cover 2 of those screw holes. Now that first one I loosened there, that one is slightly shorter than the other 3, and it is important to get those back in the same place, simply because if you do not get those in the same place, it either won't hold properly because the screw is too short, or if it's too long, it will protrude through and interfere with the mechanism itself. Now with these case screws, they were unusually tight. As you can tell, especially on this 4th one, I did have to put a bit of extra pressure downward onto it so as to prevent damaging the screw itself. Now, fortunately, the case screws are not visible when the shutter is in place. So aesthetically, as long as they hold the case together aesthetically, they don't have to be perfect. But if you chew up the head too much, they definitely will become more difficult to work with. And again, setting those aside so that I can remember which screws they are. And then verifying the length. And that's where I noticed that that one screw was shorter. Just making a note for myself on where that one came from. And I separate the case. Now in this shutter, as you can see, it uses a 3-blade shutter. And here I'm trying to move the shutter actuator, and then I'm removing the screw which acts as the pivot for that 3rd shutter blade. The other 2 blades are on a post pivot. And definitely do be careful when handling the shutter blades. They are very thin spring steel. They will bend very easily, and if you bend them out of shape, they are right near impossible to get back into shape. You can also see on those shutter blades a lot of staining. That is from dried grease and excessive graphite in the shutter. And at this point, you can see I still haven't noticed the second screw for that lever. And I'm just trying to get it to twist on the pivot, because as with the other shutter I have, it was held in with dry grease, and simply twisting it, it broke free and came off the bushing. And here's where I finally noticed that second screw. So I get that screw out, make note of what type of screw it is, and then now give it a little twist to get through any sort of dried grease, and it comes right free. And now that that lever's out, I'm able to go in and get the 4 screws out that hold the main drive spring in place. When I was opening the shutter, all 4 of these screws were uncomfortably loose. They took almost no effort to turn. And here I'm just trying to maneuver that arm to access the other 2, while also unhooking the spring for that arm on the main drive spring. Because that spring I'm trying to disconnect holds that arm towards the lever, and that spring actually closes the shutter during the interval mode. You can see there I swung that lever out again so I could access these screws. And here I was just trying to get that all maneuvered again so I can gain access to that 4th screw, which is there by the lens tube. And here I had to wind that main drive clockwise so I could get the driver in to that screw to remove that 4th screw. And once that 4th screw was loose, I then had to maneuver the arm past the pivot and the lever there. I was able to pull that through, and then I removed the 4th screw from the plate here I'm just making sure any other parts that I may have missed. And I decided to go ahead and remove this lever just so I can make absolutely certain that I got the entire plate clean, as that lever itself did not move much and I couldn't move it entirely out of the way. Definitely don't want any sort of dry grease or dried oil hanging around inside the mechanism at all. And here I'm just checking the springs, making sure none of them got bent or damaged. And this is when I'm realizing that the pivot holding that one arm in is directly screwed into the mechanism plate. And I move ahead to remove the spanner screws holding the shutter actuating ring in place. Again, these are using the same spanner tool that the first three were using, and unfortunately I don't have the right size, and the ones I do have are not quite of a high enough quality to modify for it. And that's actually right there when I noticed that shim washer that I'd lost earlier. I go ahead and place that with the pinions. Go ahead and try using a toothpick to get those fully wound out, just so that it could cause as little damage as possible. Unfortunately, using the screwdriver the way I was, it did scratch the mechanism plate. Not in any place that would cause any harm to the mechanism itself. Mostly cosmetic damage, but to prevent as much as possible, I was trying to use a toothpick. And here, just a final double check to make sure I didn't miss any sort of levers or anything that needed to come off. And I move on to the diaphragm. And the diaphragm here, you have the setting plate, which is attached to the setting ring simply by two screws. Both of these screws were heavily caked in very dried, very sticky grease. But once I loosened both of those, the setting lever came right off, as you can see here. And then with a pair of tweezers, I go ahead and pull that plate off with both of those with both the screws right there. And there I'm just double checking the condition of those screws. And I turn out the diaphragm blades. Unfortunately, they did stick into the case due to some dried oil as well as the tight fit of the pivots. And here I'm just checking the condition of the diaphragm blades, making sure there aren't any that are damaged, bent, um, and the overall state of the blades. And with that is a fully disassembled shutter.